I am here representing the International Arctic Science Committee, but I want to start out by saying something that is hopefully obvious to this audience, and that's that Arctic science is inherently international and an inherently collaborative endeavor. And so IASC is really connected to a much broader Arctic science community, so hopefully if you take nothing else away from this, that IASC can be a point of contact in a much broader Arctic science network. If you aren't familiar with IASC, we have 23 member countries, and essentially we exist to help connect Arctic researchers across disciplinary boundaries and across national boundaries that can impede Arctic science. We've been working since 1990, so have a nice strong history. We're an observer to the Arctic Council, which might have been your previous interaction with IASC. But one of the tasks that was laid out for IASC with its founding was coordination of Arctic research across countries. And in doing so, IASC convenes a decadal process called the International Conference on Arctic Research Planning. So ICARP exists because a changing Arctic challenges our understanding and our ability to provide knowledge for decision makers who are interested in the Arctic. And at the same time, the Arctic exists at a scale that international coordination is crucial. And so ICARP provides integrated priorities for forward-looking, collaborative, interdisciplinary Arctic research and observing to address those challenges. And despite the name, ICARP is not just one conference. So the most recent ICARP, which was conducted a few years ago, was a year-long series of events that engaged the full range of Arctic scientists across all 23 IASC member countries. It engaged more than 20 international bodies in this series of events, and also really made an effort to engage with Arctic indigenous peoples, Arctic residents, northern residents, to make sure that the research questions are coming from the science community but are also relevant to those in the Arctic. So the overarching Arctic research priorities identified in the most recent ICARP process are these three on the screen now. So 1, the role of the Arctic in the global system. 2, observing and predicting future climate dynamics and ecosystem responses. And 3, understanding the vulnerability and resilience of Arctic environments and societies and supporting sustainable development. So those are pretty overarching, high-level research priorities, which is why the full ICARP report goes into many more specific research questions, and I want to pull out a few of them here to show you some breadth. And so these are not meant to be definitive, but are illustrative examples, I think. So for example, under Goal 1, understanding the global role of the Arctic, we want to understand both rapid climate change in the Arctic while also understanding Arctic to mid-latitude connections like those which we just heard about. We want to focus on the dramatically shrinking sea ice in the Arctic, but not studying it on its own, but rather linking studies across all spheres, so understanding how the sea ice connects with the ocean, connects with the atmosphere, connects with the ecosystem, the biosphere. So on observations and predictions, we want to establish flagship observatories linked through SEON, the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks. So we're identifying flagship observatories here so that we have coordinated observations that can give us deeper understanding of processes happening in the Arctic. We want to also invest in both new technology as well as improved models. So we want to be able to conduct science that we haven't been able to conduct before. So that's the new technology aspect, collect those observations that haven't been possible previously. But also, it's important for us to think about computational models because we want to really understand these processes we're observing and predict what's going to happen in the future on changing conditions. In our third overarching priority of sustainable development, an example of a priority would be developing integrated sustainability indicators to understand social ecological systems. So in these systems where humans are integrated and connected with the environment, it's important to have indicators to be able to monitor and to understand those key leverage points. Another example is understanding how institutions and power structures contribute towards Arctic sustainable development. So if we're going to build resilient societies in the Arctic, we really need to fully understand them. And I hope that this also highlights the breadth of Arctic science that we're talking about as a truly interdisciplinary endeavor. In addition to those research priorities, there are a few overarching messages to how we want to do our science. One is in communication, so facilitating science to policy knowledge transfer between the research community and end users with a range of tools. Two is incorporating traditional and local knowledge, so greater efforts to incorporate indigenous and local knowledge and to engage northern and indigenous communities in setting priorities, in co-designing and in co-producing research, so early on in the research process and not later on. And in capacity building, so building long-term capacity among researchers, decision makers, and Arctic and indigenous and non-indigenous residents, so that we have the capacity for people to be able to do the science as well as to use the science later on. And we'll hear a little bit more about the Arctic Science Ministerials later, but my main goal with this slide is to show you that ICARP is in continuity with the topics that have been brought up in the first and the second Arctic Science Ministerials. So you can see that the three major topics of ICARP and the overarching messages are there on the left of the screen, and they're reflected within the topics of the first and second Arctic Science Ministerials. So this is an iterative building process and not a revolutionary process every few years, which should be encouraging given the scale of investment and time necessary to understand the Arctic. So IASC, as an international science organization, we have 5 scientific working groups. They are intentionally overlapping, and this is a word cloud that shows you what happens when you put together the keyword expertise keywords from our 200 representatives. And you can see a lot of different topics represented there. And that's the goal here, to show you just how diverse Arctic research is. And we talked about some high-level science priorities. I also want to talk about some maybe more focused science priorities. So our IASC working groups identify where their research programs are going to go, both to identify where IASC science funding should go, but also to serve as an example and a leader within the Arctic science community and hopefully harness and catalyze research in those directions. So don't worry, I'm not going to read through all of these. But I do want to highlight the breadth of research and just how specific some of the research questions are, because the aim is to be societally relevant and society beneficial. And I'll point you towards either the IASC website or come find me later if you want the full list here. So I know I only have 2 minutes left, don't worry. I want to mention Arctic Science Summit Week as a great annual way that convenes the Arctic science community. And I also want to highlight in particular our meeting in 2020, because for the second time it's going to be co-scheduled with the Senior Arctic Official Meeting that will be taking place immediately right before. And I'm highlighting that because we're going to have a Science and Policy Day. I've been talking a lot about Arctic science priorities, and these aren't developed in a vacuum. Arctic scientists also want to make sure that their research is impactful, and we can do that by making sure that we craft research questions so that they are helpful to decision makers. And it's only by getting scientists and decision makers building those personal connections that we can do that. There are lots of other initiatives in the Arctic that I haven't talked about. These ones are all related to IASC. And beyond developing the research questions, we also want to focus on how we do Arctic science, from observations to data, to being inclusive and creative in how we ask our scientific questions and research programs. So I'll end in my last minute just with mentioning one particular highlighted project that you might have heard of already, the MOSAIC cruise, the Multidisciplinary Drifting Observatory for the Study of Arctic Climate, freezing an icebreaker in on one side of the Arctic and then using it as a platform as it drifts across the Arctic for an entire winter before it comes out on the other side. And I'm highlighting it partly self-servingly because it started with an IASC discussion, but also because it's a major keystone initiative that has built because it went from an international idea to countries stepping up to say how they could support it, whether through logistical support, platform, sponsoring scientists to be there, and scientists to work really interdisciplinarily to think about the Arctic as a system and taking advantage of this unique opportunity. It's kicked off a lot of other projects and pulled into and been part of other projects, whether the Year of Polar Prediction, Terrestrial Mosaic to study more coastal linkages. So it's a great example of how Arctic science can be really beneficial. So with that, I'll wrap up and say, please do find me later with questions. I'll be on stage and see more on the IASC website. Thank you.